Hello YouTube. Throughout almost 250 years of history, the United States has had relations with countries that have existed well before the establishment of the US, as well as countries that are relatively new to the international stage. However, throughout those nearly 250 years of existence, those alliances have shifted back and forth between animosity with the US as well as friendly relations with the US. In this video, we will cover 10 countries that have seen their loyalties towards the United States shift through time. The first country we will cover at number 10 on this list is Turkey. In the early 19th century, relations with the Middle East got off to a rocky start when the United States got involved in the First and Second Barbary Wars, a series of conflicts that included a coalition of European countries and the United States versus several North African states loosely aligned with the Ottoman Empire. These conflicts mainly related to the issue of paying tribute to do business in that part of the world. The US and Europe got their way, and for the rest of the 19th century, the Ottomans were careful not to get the United States too involved in its affairs. The US and Turkey were on opposite sides during World War I, with the US on the side of the Allies, while Turkey, known as the Ottoman Empire during World War I and before then, was on the side of the Central Powers, with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Joining the side of the Central Powers during World War I was a costly mistake for the Ottoman Empire. They joined the losing side, and, well, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist and was replaced with the Republic of Turkey. However, following one more world war, where Turkey was a neutral actor, Turkey and the US would become close allies during the Cold War. United in their common disdain for communism and Soviet military actions on the Soviet-Turkish border, both countries took action to strengthen their military and diplomatic ties. For example, Turkey joined NATO. This means both sides are obligated to provide military assistance in the event either country is attacked and invokes Article 5. Today, while both countries feud over the various political crises of the Middle East, both countries ultimately contribute to the NATO alliance and have a strong relationship in general. At number 9 is another Mediterranean country similar to Turkey. Italy and the United States were on opposing sides during a world war, in this case, the Second World War. Italy was obligated to assist Nazi Germany in its military endeavors because of treaties as well as like-minded leadership. However, once the US made military advances into North Africa and eventually even into Italy itself, the Italians deposed the infamous Mussolini and restored democracy. Their citizens demanded that the government align with capitalism and the West. The United States helped Italy rebuild with the Marshall Plan. They not only helped build the country financially, they also established deeper ties diplomatically and economically with Italy. In the 1990s, Italy also joined the European Union and was already a member of NATO. With these alliances, Italy and the US became strong allies heading into the 21st century. Next on the list at number 8 is Russia. In the 1860s, Russia sold part of its North American territory, Alaska, to the United States. At first, many Americans criticized the Secretary of State at the time, William Seward, for negotiating the purchase for Alaska, because although he paid a relatively small amount for it at the time, Many Americans thought that Alaska was a unworthy investment because of its unforgiving terrain and climate and the challenges those two issues presented to settlement of the territory. Many Americans referred to it as Seward's Folly and believed that the Russian government swindled their own government out of millions of dollars. In the 20th century, the Russian Empire would take a turn for the worse and cease to exist due to a communist revolution in 1917. However, prior to 1917, Russia and the United States were fighting on both sides during the First World War before Russia decided to withdraw. And a few decades further down the timeline in the 20th century during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union fought on both sides to defeat Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union and the United States had a big following out after defeating Nazi Germany, though, because the Soviet Union wanted to propagate its communist ideology, while the US wanted to form Germany within its own capitalist and Western ideals. Both countries had a period of relative peace during the 1990s and early 2000s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union and into the Cold War. Russia was looking to open up and wanted to try to create warm relations with the US, and they even helped construct the International Space Station with the United States during the 1990s. And let's not forget to mention that both of these countries had a fierce rivalry during the space race. The fact that both countries managed to come together for a short time during this decade was a big deal. However, once Vladimir Putin rose to power and began to exert Russian influence within Eastern Europe and across his borders, relations with the US started to increasingly get strained going into the 21st century, especially when Vladimir Putin began to bully the Ukraine and ultimately decide to invade in 2022. That has caused relations to collapse. So you could say in 2024, relations between the United States and Russia are far worse than they have ever been during the 1990s and especially prior to the 1917 revolution. At number 7 on this list, we will be traveling to the Caribbean, to the island country of Cuba. In Cuba's beginning, the United States assisted Cuba in its fight against Spain. At that time, the United States was still dedicated to reducing European influence in the Americas, and Cuba was the perfect excuse to reduce Spanish influence. America assisted Cuba in achieving its independence in the beginning part of the 20th century. However, a few decades later, in the middle part of the 20th century, the United States and Cuba would take different paths during the Cold War. Cuba would experience a communist revolution in 1959, led by Fidel Castro. They would even bring the world to the brink of nuclear war by letting the Soviets stockpile nuclear weapons on the island. And even after the Cold War, Cuba would remain one of the few last remaining communist countries to exist. That has caused relations to be frosty well into the 21st century. However, Barack Obama tried to change that. Relations did briefly warm in 2016 when the US opened its embassy back up in Havana. However, once Donald Trump has become elected in 2017, relations with Cuba deteriorated. It will be interesting to see how US and Cuban relations develop in the future, especially with massive unrest on the Cuban island following many issues with its economy. At number 6, the first country from the Middle East on this list is Iran. Prior to the 1979 revolution, the United States had a decent relationship with the Shah of Iran. However, he was unpopular with his people and was ultimately ousted after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Relations between the US and Iran collapsed after the infamous hostage crisis that caused Jimmy Carter to lose the 1980 election. Stark cultural differences also became more apparent as the new Iranian government tried to convince its society to follow its strict interpretation of Islam. In the decades since, the Islamic theocracy has grown stronger and more anti-American sentiments have become entrenched within Iranian society. The United States' close relationships with Iranian enemies in the region like Israel and Saudi Arabia have also exacerbated tensions between the US and Iran. The current Iranian government has faced several crises in the past several years. Iran did experience massive protests in 2022 that threatened the government's legitimacy. However, after a brutal crackdown, the government restored order. In 2024, the government would once again be thrown into chaos as its president, Hassan Rouhani, died in a helicopter crash as it traversed harsh mountain terrain and unfavorable weather conditions. It was also, ironically, a 45-year-old helicopter supplied by the United States, which was given to the previous monarchical government. The supreme leader is in his 80s and the people have elected a moderate. There is also an active movement in Iran towards promoting friendly ties with the West, but their voices are often silenced by the regime. So, it is difficult to see where US-Iranian relations will be in the coming future. The next country I think we ought to discuss is south of the border of the United States, and that is Mexico. In the 19th century, the United States and Mexico had a war over the northern half of Mexico's territory. This war resulted in Mexico losing its northern half of the territory. This would strain relations for the rest of the 19th century. However, time heals all wounds and relations would gradually improve. While Mexico faced many challenges, it was also gradually embracing political and social reform, as well as growing its economy, especially after the Mexican Revolution in the 1910s. Fast forward to the 1990s, Mexico and the United States would sign the NAFTA treaty. This helped integrate both countries' economies and created benefits for both. The United States is bothered by the seemingly constant immigration crisis on its border, whether the people crossing are Mexican nationals or hail from a different country. The United States is still concerned about what Mexico can do to help out on the situation on the southern border. Both countries also share a 1,000-mile border, which has communities dotted throughout the region. These communities often rely on trade and business from the respective country on the other side of the border. This situation has created a strong interest group in Washington that pushes for reconciliation and integration with America's southern neighbor. However, there is another faction of American society that view the border situation as a national security threat. Mexico also has groups who are skeptical of American influence in Mexico, such as people worried about the economy, as well as what Mexico called political interference when the US and Canada recently criticized its judicial reforms. Despite these differences in the US and Mexico, both countries seem to have a strong relationship. At number 4, and the first country from Asia on this list, is Vietnam. If you are familiar with the Vietnam War, you will know before 1975 there were actually two Vietnams. The US supported the capitalist South, while the North received support from a variety of communist countries. However, over time, the US support wasn't enough for South Vietnam to withstand the North Vietnam's military assaults, and both Vietnams would become united under the communist banner. From 1975 to 1995, both countries struggled to move past the devastating conflict. However, in 1995, the US normalized relations with Vietnam. In the 21st century, even though both countries had animosity towards each other, they would find a common enemy in China. The United States and Vietnam would gradually form stronger political, military, and economic ties during the 2010s and 2020s to counter this Chinese influence. At number 3 on our list is Germany. When the US first gained independence in 1776, like Italy, Germany wasn't even a country yet, just a loose confederation of kingdoms within a larger entity known as the Holy Roman Empire. After the Louisiana Purchase and before the Civil War, many people residing within this area in Europe immigrated to the new Louisiana Territory within the United States. They helped transform much of the undeveloped terrain into farmland that made the United States even wealthier. Fast forward to the first half of the 20th century, the United States and Germany fought on opposite sides of both world wars. However, Germany was split after World War II. West Germany took the route of fostering friendly relations with the West and free market policies to rebuild its country, while East Germany decided to reconstruct its society based on socialist principles and align itself with the USSR. The US had friendly relations with West Germany, but did not like communist East Germany for obvious reasons. When the Cold War ended, both sides reintegrated into just Germany and adopted most of West Germany's policies. The US and the newly united Germany formed a strong relationship heading into the 21st century. Both countries are in NATO and have strong trade ties. Nowadays, the US-German alliance is seen as crucial throughout the European community. At number 2 on this list is the final country that made up the Axis powers during World War II, and that country is Japan. When the US first established relations with Japan in 1858, it forced Japan to step out of hundreds of years of isolation. While Japan grew and began spreading its influence throughout Asia, it was careful not to antagonize the US and instead tried to create stronger trade relations with the country. However, once its ambitions grew, its new ambitions forced it to change its mind. Japan carried out the most devastating attack on US territory during World War II with its attack on Pearl Harbor. However, the US carried out the first and only nuclear attack during war when it dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima in 1945. Both countries suffered untold tragedies at the hands of each other in the Pacific theater. In the post-World War II world, Japan and the US would put their differences aside and become great trading and military partners. The US needed a strong, innovative, capitalist ally in East Asia, and Japan was the perfect candidate, especially in the 21st century with common threats like North Korea and China. Japan and the US have had to form strong relations. Let's not also forget to mention that the Japanese and the Americans also have a strong cultural soft power relationship. At number 1 on this list is the United Kingdom. At first, the United Kingdom helped establish many things that helped shape the American identity, like what language we speak, how we measure things, and how we have decided to govern our country. However, once the King of England began to ask too much from his North American colonists, they decided to rebel and ultimately form their own country in 1776. Understandably, neither country really wanted to establish a friendship with the other country after this war. The United States and the United Kingdom even fought in another war in 1812. In the following decades, both countries would continue to have border disputes on the Canadian border. In the 20th century, the UK and the US would put their differences aside and fight on the same side during both world wars. The US was instrumental in Great Britain securing its sovereignty and being on the right side of victory in both conflicts. Both countries would cooperate during the Cold War. Both countries were Western capitalist countries entrenched in tradition, so it was no surprise that they found commonality during the Cold War. As of today, in the 21st century, both countries have a solid relationship diplomatically, culturally, economically, and militarily. This is my first video in my America250 series. In this series, I aim to cover various topics that have happened during the lengthy history of the United States from 1776 to 2026. This video series is meant to celebrate a quarter of a millennium of American history and contributions to the advancement of global society. This video was not made with the intention of questioning any country's loyalty to the US. If you are from one of these countries, please do not be offended. Also, if you feel another country deserves to be on the list, feel free to list it below, and I'd love to hear your reason. I also made this video as a cautionary tale of what could happen in the future to the countries that we view as partners today, how they may either choose to stay on a path of friendship with us or choose to go on a path of adversity against us. This is also a video of optimism because it also paints a future for countries to possibly create a future of friendship with the United States. And as always, if you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like and subscribe, and have a blessed day.